The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly bark honed by decades of selling off men's lives piece by piece, echoed across the hard-packed dirt of the Hemlock farmstead. It was the spring of 1969, and another old-timer had finally given up the ghost, his land and livelihood now laid bare for the picking. Thomas Callahan stood at the back of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, feeling the familiar chill that had less to do with the March wind and more to do with the scene before him. He'd seen too many of these auctions. Each one felt like another nail in the coffin of a way of life he was desperately trying to hold on to. He wasn't here for the land. He knew he couldn't afford the 80 acres of prime bottomland that bordered his own property to the west. He was just hoping to snag an old disc harrow, or maybe a hay rake, for a price that wouldn't make his wife, Mary, wince. He'd driven over in his 65 Ford F-250, its straight-six engine idling with a quiet, dependable rhythm that was a comfort to him. The truck, like everything else he owned, was paid for. It had dents, a patch of rust over the rear wheel well, and the driver's seat was worn through to the springs. But when he turned the key, it started. Every single time. That's what mattered. A stir went through the crowd as the auctioneer moved on to the real prize, the land. All right, folks, here it is. The parcel you've all been waiting for. 80 acres of the finest black dirt in Lancaster County. Not a rock in it. Drains perfect. You couldn't ask for better ground to put corn in. Thomas saw Richard Sterling push his way to the front, a wide grin plastered on his face. Rick was everything Thomas was not. Where Thomas was quiet and deliberate, Rick was loud and flashy. Where Thomas's clothes were faded from sun and work, Rick's were crisp and new from the J.C. Penney catalogue. He'd just bought a brand-new John Deere 4020, the talk of the county, complete with a factory-installed cab that looked like something out of a spaceship. He'd driven it to the auction, parking it ostentatiously near the road, its green paint gleaming, a monument to borrowed money and boundless ambition. "Do I hear 10,000 to open?" the auctioneer bellowed. Rick's hand shot up. 20! He shouted, his voice full of swagger. A murmur went through the crowd. $20,000 was a hell of a starting bid. It was a power play meant to scare off the smaller fish. It worked. A few other farmers who had been shuffling their feet and looking interested suddenly found something fascinating to study on the toes of their boots. Thomas just watched, a knot tightening in his gut. That land had belonged to the Hemlock family for 100 years. Now it was just a number, a commodity to be gobbled up by the man with the biggest line of credit at the Farmers' Home Administration. The bidding went up in sluggish $1,000 increments. But every counterbid was met instantly by Rick Sterling's confident shout, his arm pumping in the air like he was flagging down a train. Finally, at $28,500, the auctioneer's gavel fell. "Sold to Mr. Richard Sterling." A round of applause, mixed with envious grumbles, rippled through the farmers. Rick turned and took a theatrical bow, laughing as a few of his cronies slapped him on the back. He was king of the world, or at least king of this small corner of it. Later, as the crowd thinned, Thomas was running his hand over the rusted frame of an old Oliver Transport disc. The gangs were stiff, the bearings probably shot, but the frame was solid steel. He could get it cheap, take it home, and spend a few winter nights in the shop with a torch and a wrench, bringing it back to life. That was his way. "Still shopping in the antique aisle, Tom?" Thomas turned. Rick Sterling was standing behind him, smelling of expensive aftershave and self-satisfaction. His friends flanked him, smirking. "This old iron will still turn dirt, Rick," Thomas said, his voice even. Rick laughed, a loud, booming sound that grated on Thomas's nerves. "Sure it will. But for how long? You ought to get yourself a real tractor to pull that thing. That old farm-all of yours is going to cough its last breath one of these days. You can't farm in the space age with a museum piece." The farm-all M. It had been his father's tractor, bought new in 1948. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, the decals peeled away by decades of sun and rain. But Thomas knew its heart. He knew the precise growl of its four-cylinder engine, the particular way the clutch engaged, the familiar smell of hot oil and gasoline that clung to it like a second skin. "It runs fine," Thomas said, turning back to the disc. "And it's paid for. Just like my land." The words hung in the air between them. It was a quiet jab, but it hit its mark. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even insecurity, crossed Rick's face before being replaced by his usual cocksure grin. "You can't make money by saving it, Callahan," Rick scoffed, leaning in conspiratorially. "This is a new era. You gotta spend it to make it. Leverage. That's the name of the game. While you're tinkering with this pile of rust, I'll have that new 80 acres plowed, planted, and making me money. You're living in the past." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt dismissive. "You think about it," he said, then turned and walked away with his entourage, their laughter echoing back at Thomas. Thomas stood there for a long time, the cold steel of the old disc under his hand. He watched Rick Sterling climb into his shiny new Chevrolet pickup, the V8 engine rumbling to life with an effortless roar. He saw the future, or at least what everyone was telling him the future was supposed to be. It was shiny, loud, and deep in debt. He looked down at his own hands, the knuckles scarred, the fingernails permanently rimmed with grease and dirt. His way was quieter, slower. It was a path of patience and preservation. But as he stood there, alone in the dwindling light, he had to wonder if Rick was right. Was he just a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to a bygone age? Before we go any further, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Rick Sterling? The kind who measures his worth by the shine on his chrome and the size of his loan? Or are you more of a Tom Callahan, believing that what you own outright is all that truly matters? Let me know in the comments below, because this difference in thinking is the heart of our story. The weeks that followed the auction blurred into the familiar, grueling rhythm of spring planting. While Rick Sterling's new 4020 roared across the former Hemlock land, its diesel engine a constant, high-pitched whine on the horizon, Thomas was in his workshop, giving the Farm-all M its annual resurrection. The big tractor sat in the center of the barn, its simple, rugged architecture exposed under the single bare bulb that hung from a rafter. The air was thick with the smell of penetrating oil and old grease. The magneto was weeping oil again, a slow, persistent drip from the drive seal. It was a common ailment for these old tractors, a minor annoyance that could become a major problem if ignored. Thomas drained the thick, dark 20-weight oil into a galvanized pan, the gurgle of the fluid a familiar sound in the quiet barn. He laid his tools out on a clean rag on the fender, a half-inch wrench for the mounting bolts, a screwdriver for the cap, a set of feeler gauges. Each tool had its place, its purpose known and respected. With careful, practiced movements, he removed the distributor cap and wires, marking the position of the rotor with a chalk line on the housing. He knew from experience that getting the timing off by even a single degree would make the old girl hard to start and run rough. He unbolted the magneto, a heavy, self-contained unit of magnets and coils, and gently worked it free from the engine block. There it was, the old cork seal, compressed and brittle as a dead leaf. He scraped it out with the tip of his pocket knife and wiped the housing clean. The new seal, a modern neoprene one he'd bought at the co-op, slid into place with a satisfying firmness. He spent the better part of an hour putting it all back together, his hands moving with an intimacy born of 1,000 similar repairs. He torqued the bolts just so, not by a wrench's measure, but by the feel in his hands. He set the points gap to 15,000ths of an inch, the width of a matchbook cover, just as his father had taught him. When it was all done, he climbed onto the steel pan seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter rod with his heel. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a cough and a puff of black smoke from the upright exhaust pipe. It settled into its distinctive, rhythmic cadence. Pop, 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 pop. It wasn't the smooth hum of a modern six-cylinder. It was the sound of 4 big pistons firing with deliberate, implacable power. It was the sound of his father, of his grandfather. It was the sound of his farm. He let it warm up, the vibrations running up through the seat and into his bones, a feeling as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. Across the fence, Rick Sterling was making 3 passes to Thomas's 1. His new 8-bottom moldboard plough turned the black earth in long, perfect ribbons, the 4020's diesel engine never straining. Thomas, with his old 2-bottom plough, felt like a tortoise racing a hare. At the grain elevator, the talk was always about Rick. "Did you see the rig Sterling's running?" one farmer would say, leaning against a sack of seed corn. "Got air conditioning and an AM/FM radio in that cab. Farms in a dress shirt if he wants. Heard he bought another 160 acres over by the river," another would add. "The bank just keeps handing him money." They'd see Thomas walk in, his jeans stained with grease, and the conversation would falter. They'd nod at him, their eyes filled with a kind of pitying respect. "How's that old M running, Tom?" they'd ask, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "When are you going to get with the times?" "She runs good," was all he'd ever say. The real test came in early June. He was cultivating his first-year corn with his other tractor, a 1951 John Deere Model A he called Putt-Putt for its unique 2-cylinder exhaust note. It was smaller, nimbler than the Farmel, perfect for navigating the narrow rows. He was halfway down a long row when it happened. A sudden, violent bang from the engine, a sound like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil, followed by a shower of metallic grinding. A thick plume of acrid blue smoke erupted from the engine block, and the tractor shuddered to a dead stop, its flywheel locked solid. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of Rick Sterling's machinery. Thomas knew instantly what it was. He'd thrown a rod. It had punched a fist-sized hole right through the side of the engine block. Catastrophic failure. He sat there for a moment, the sun beating down on his neck, a cold, sick feeling spreading through his stomach. He looked out over the field of young corn, the green shoots just beginning to show promise. He had 80 acres of it, and the weeds were coming on strong. Without this cultivator tractor, he'd lose the battle. It took him the rest of the day to tow the crippled John Deere back to the barn using the Farmel. The dead weight of it was a physical manifestation of his predicament. That night, Mary found him staring at the ruined engine, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What are we going to do, Tom?" she asked, her voice quiet with worry. "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I can't afford a new tractor. I can't even afford a decent used one right now." "What about a loan?" she ventured. "Just a small one." "To get us through." He looked at her, at the worry lines etched around her eyes, and then back at the dead machine. The thought of walking into the bank, hat in hand, of putting his name on a note held by the same men who were funding Rick Sterling's empire, felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. It felt like the beginning of the end. "No," he said, his voice firm. "No loans. I'll find another way." The other way was a salvage yard 3 counties over, a sprawling graveyard of rusted farm equipment. After 2 days of searching, he found it. A wrecked Model A, rolled over in a ditch, but its engine block was intact. He paid $200 for it, cash he'd been saving for a new water heater. The next week was a blur of greasy, back-breaking labor. He rigged a chain hoist to a thick oak beam in the barn and wrestled the old engine out of the frame. It was a dead weight of over 1,000 pounds of cast iron. Then came the painstaking process of swapping over the usable parts: the carburetor, the governor, the magneto. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, his back screamed in protest, and every muscle ached. He worked late into the night, the barn illuminated by that single bare bulb, fueled by Mary's coffee and a stubborn refusal to fail. Finally, the salvaged engine was bolted into the frame. He connected the fuel line, filled the radiator, and checked the oil. With a deep breath, he spun the flywheel. It turned over with the familiar chuff-chuff of the 2-cylinder engine. He opened the petcocks, gave it another spin, and then closed them. He climbed onto the seat, took a deep breath, and pulled back on the clutch lever. With a final, mighty heave on the flywheel, the engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with its signature pop-pop, pop-pop. He'd done it. The sound was rough. The engine smoked a little, but it was alive. Exhausted but triumphant, he engaged the transmission and drove the resurrected tractor out of the barn and back into the sunlight. He was 2 weeks behind on his cultivating, and the weeds had a strong head start. He had a long fight ahead of him. But as he looked across the fence line, where Rick Sterling was already finishing his second cutting of hay with a brand-new Heston windrower, Thomas felt not envy, but a grim sense of resolve. Rick had the bank on his side. Thomas Callahan had only his 2 hands, and for now, that would have to be enough. The world turned, and the years from 1970 to 1974 were golden for American farmers. A perfect storm of global demand, government policy, and a bit of geopolitical maneuvering sent grain prices into the stratosphere. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. wheat crop. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, emptied American silos and sent commodity markets soaring. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, the dirt under a farmer's feet was as good as gold. The message from Washington was clear, broadcast by the booming voice of Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz. Get big or get out. He urged farmers to borrow, to expand, to plant, fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The credit taps at the local banks and the Farmers' Home Administration were opened wide, and a wave of feverish optimism swept through the heartland. No one rode that wave higher than Rick Sterling. He became the local poster boy for the new agriculture. The profits from his expanded acreage were staggering, and he leveraged every penny into more. He traded his now obsolete John Deere 4020 for a monstrous international harvester, the Hen 66, a beast of a tractor with a turbocharged diesel engine, dual rear wheels that stood taller than a man, and a factory cab with tinted glass, air conditioning, and a stereo system that Thomas could sometimes hear from a quarter-mile away. Rick bought another quarter section of land, this time paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the diner choke on their coffee. He bought a brand-new Gleaner L2 combine, a machine so large it looked like a battleship, sailing through his fields of wheat and corn. His farmstead, once a modest collection of buildings, now looked like a dealer's lot, a gleaming testament to modern, high-stakes farming. He traded his Chevy pickup for a new Lincoln Continental, a land yacht of chrome and leather that seemed absurdly out of place on the dusty county roads. He even approached Thomas one afternoon, pulling his Lincoln to a stop by the fence where Thomas was mending a wire break. He got out leaving the engine running and the air conditioning blasting. "Tom," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost pitying. "I'm making you a serious offer. I'll buy you out, all of it. I'll give you a fair price, more than fair. You and Mary could move to town, buy a nice little house. You wouldn't have to kill yourself on this old junk anymore." He gestured vaguely at Thomas's farm, at the barn with its weathered paint and the old farmel parked beside it. "This way of doing things, it's over. It's a new world. You can't compete." Thomas straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. He looked at Rick, at his soft, clean hands and his expensive shirt. Then he looked back at his own land, the land his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. "It's not for sale, Rick," he said quietly. Rick shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. "You're a stubborn man, Callahan. I'm trying to help you." "I don't need your help," Thomas replied. "I'm doing just fine." But fine was a relative term. While Rick was getting rich, Thomas was simply getting by, albeit more comfortably than before. The high grain prices were a welcome windfall, but he saw them for what they were, a temporary aberration, not a new permanent reality. He resisted the siren song of easy credit. Instead of buying new land or new machines, he used the extra money to finally pay off the last of the small mortgage his father had taken out decades ago. The day he walked out of the bank with the deed, free and clear, was one of the proudest of his life. There was no fanfare, no backslapping. It was a quiet, personal victory. He used the rest of the profits to shore up what he already had. He put a new steel roof on the main barn, a project that took him the better part of a summer. He replaced miles of old, rusted barbed wire fence with new woven wire. He bought a slightly newer tractor, a used but well cared for International 560 gas model from the mid-60s, paying cash for it from a retiring farmer. It wasn't fancy, but it gave the aging farmer M some much-needed relief during the heavy tillage seasons. His neighbors saw his caution not as wisdom, but as a failure of nerve. At the co-op, they'd talk about Rick Sterling's latest conquest, then look over at Thomas picking up a few bags of seed. "Poor Tom," they'd whisper, sitting on a gold mine and too scared to dig. "Thinks it's still the Great Depression." His old man was the same way. The mockery was quieter now, replaced by a kind of dismissive pity. He was a relic, an oddity, a man out of step with the glorious, booming times. One afternoon in the late fall of 1974, Thomas was at the grain elevator, settling up his account. The manager, an old, shrewd farmer named Earl, who had seen booms and busts come and go like the seasons, pulled him aside. "You hear what Paul Volcker over at the Fed is talking about, Tom?" Earl asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Can't say I have, Earl." "He's talking about whipping inflation, talking about jacking up interest rates. Real high, all this easy money sloshing around, all this debt everyone's taking on." Earl trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "The bill's gonna come due. It always does." As Thomas walked out into the cool autumn air, he looked across the street to the Lancaster County National Bank. Rick Sterling's new Lincoln was parked at the curb. Through the big plate glass window, Thomas could see him standing with the bank president, laughing, throwing his head back in a gesture of pure, unadulterated confidence. The bank president clapped Rick on the shoulder, the picture of a happy partnership. A cold knot tightened in Thomas Callahan's stomach. It was the same feeling he'd had at the auction 5 years earlier, but stronger now, more defined. He looked at his own calloused hands, stained with the honest dirt and grease of his labor. He looked back at the bank, at the sound of fragile, hollow laughter drifting across the street. The sky, which had seemed so bright and full of limitless promise for so long, was beginning to gather dark clouds on the western horizon. A storm was coming. He didn't know when, but he could feel it in his bones. And he feared that many of his neighbors, drunk on the sunshine of the good years, had forgotten how to build an ark. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper of dust. The summer of 1976 began with a brassy, cloudless sky that settled over Lancaster County and refused to leave. The spring rains, which had been adequate, became a distant memory. By July, the corn, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture remained. The ground, that rich black dirt that was the pride of the county, cracked open in a spiderweb of fissures, hard as baked clay. Thomas Callahan felt the drought in his bones. He worked from dawn until dusk, his old International 560 chugging along with a cultivator, trying to break the crust on the soil to preserve the subsoil moisture. He left more residue on his fields than his neighbors, a practice his father had called trash farming, but one that shaded the ground and slowed evaporation. His yields would be down, he knew that, but the crop would survive. He had no debt, so survival was the only goal that mattered. Across the fence, Rick Sterling's empire was beginning to show its first hairline cracks. His vast fields of corn, planted fence row to fence row, were suffering badly. The exposed soil between the rows was blowing away in the hot prairie wind, a fine brown haze that coated everything in a gritty film. The monstrous International 1066, a machine built for heavy tillage in deep soil, now seemed like an oversized brute, its dual wheels compacting the dry earth with every pass. Fuel prices, driven high by the OPEC embargo a few years prior, made every hour of operation a costly gamble. The real blow came in August. Thomas was in his workshop, grinding the valves on the Farmel M's cylinder head, when he heard the sound. It was a high-pitched scream from across the field, followed by a loud bang, and then an abrupt, sickening silence. He walked to the edge of his property and looked over. Rick's 1066 was stopped dead in the middle of a field, a plume of greasy blue-black smoke hanging over it like a funeral shroud. He saw Rick climb down from the cab, his movements stiff with disbelief. He kicked one of the massive rear tires, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. Thomas knew that sound. It was the death rattle of a turbocharged engine. The turbocharger on that DTO-Hysane engine had likely seized, grenading itself and sending a shower of metal shavings straight into the heart of the engine. It wasn't a repair, it was a rebuild. A complete, tear-down to the crankshaft rebuild. The dealer's mechanic came out the next day in a service truck. Thomas watched from a distance as they stood around the silent tractor, shaking their heads. The bill, as the talk went at the co-op, was over $10,000. In a year where the corn crop was barely going to break even, $10,000 was a catastrophic expense. Rick had to take out another operating loan just to cover the repair. For the first time since Thomas had known him, the swagger was gone from Rick's walk. He moved with the heavy-shouldered gait of a man carrying a weight he was unused to. The drought broke that fall with a series of gully-washing thunderstorms, but it was too little, too late. The harvest was a bust for everyone, but for those leveraged to the hilt, it was a disaster. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of the boom, began to slide as global supply caught up with demand. The golden years were over. Through 1977 and 1978, the situation worsened. It was a slow, grinding decline. Land values, which had soared to impossible heights, stagnated and then began to fall. The banks, once so eager to lend, grew cautious, Loan renewal meetings became tense, drawn-out affairs. Rick Sterling, who had once been the bank's favorite son, was now just another name on a worrying balance sheet. He was forced to sell off a 40-acre parcel to cover his operating notes. He told everyone it was a strategic move, that the ground was marginal anyway, but the farmers who gathered at the diner knew better. They saw it for what it was, the first chunk of ice breaking away from the glacier. Thomas, meanwhile, continued his quiet, steady rhythm. He had a poor harvest like everyone else, but his costs were a fraction of Rick's. When a bearing went out on his old Oliver disc, he didn't call a dealer. He spent an evening in his shop with a punch and a hammer, pressing in a new $12 bearing himself. His Farmel M developed a crack in the exhaust manifold. He took it off, drove into town to a welder he knew, and had it brazed for the price of a case of beer. These small acts of self-sufficiency, once seen as the eccentricities of a man behind the times, were now the very bedrock of his survival. He was a ship built of solid oak, weathering a storm that was tearing the flashy, top-heavy yachts to pieces. One evening, Mary found him looking out the kitchen window, watching the lights of Rick's new gleaner combine, working late into the night, trying to squeeze every last bushel from his fields. "You feel sorry for him, don't you?" she asked softly. Thomas was quiet for a long time, watching the distant lights. "I feel sorry for what he represents," he said finally. He believed the gospel they were preaching. Get big, borrow more, bet it all. He just never figured the house would change the odds. He turned from the window, his face grim. The Bill Earl talked about all those years ago. I think the bank is about to deliver it. The storm that Thomas Callahan had felt gathering on the horizon finally broke in the autumn of 1979. It didn't come with wind or rain, but with a sterile, black and white announcement from the Federal Reserve. To combat runaway inflation, Chairman Paul Volcker was slamming on the monetary brakes. The prime interest rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, began a relentless, terrifying climb. 8%, 12, 15. By 1981, it would peak at an unimaginable 21.5%. For farmers like Rick Sterling, who were carrying massive variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating notes, once manageable, suddenly had interest payments that were double, then triple the principal. The dream of leverage had become a nightmare of usury. The phone started ringing at all hours. Men in suits started showing up in unfamiliar cars, their faces grim, their briefcases full of legal documents with words like delinquency, default, and foreclosure. The entire agricultural economy seized up. Land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre 2 years before now couldn't find a buyer at half that. The equity that had secured Rick's massive loans vanished like a morning mist. He was trapped. He couldn't make the payments, and he couldn't sell the land to cover the debt. The bank, his former partner in prosperity, was now a predator, circling, smelling blood in the water. The for sale signs began to sprout like bitter weeds along the county roads. Not the hopeful, optimistic signs of a farmer retiring on his own terms, but stark, desperate signs hammered into the ground by auctioneers and real estate agents. Families who had worked the same ground for a century packed their belongings into U-hauls and vanished, their farms swallowed by the banks or by faceless corporations from out of state. A quiet despair settled over the countryside. The lights in farmhouse windows seemed to blink out one by one. Through it all, Thomas's farm was an island of tranquility. The high interest rates that were bankrupting his neighbors meant nothing to him. He had no loans. The low crop prices hurt, but he and Mary had always lived simply. They grew a massive garden, canned their own vegetables, and raised their own chickens and hogs for meat. Their cost of living was a fraction of what it took to sustain the lifestyle Rick Sterling had built. While others were losing their land, Thomas was putting a little money away in his savings account at the credit union, earning a decent return for the first time in his life. The breaking point for Rick came in the spring of 1982. The notice appeared in the local paper, a small block of text in the legal section that felt as final as an obituary. The Lancaster County National Bank was foreclosing on the assets of Sterling Farms. There would be an auction. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect mirror of the mood. The crowd was a somber gathering of neighbours, many of whom were facing the same fate. They came not to bid, but to bear witness, to pay their last respects. The gleaming machines that had once been Rick's pride and joy were lined up in a row, looking forlorn. The International 1066, its engine rebuilt, but its paint now faded and chipped. The Gleaner Combine, a film of dust covering its once gleaming sheet metal. A lean notice from the bank was taped to the window of every cab. Thomas stood at the back, just as he had 13 years earlier at the Hemlock auction. But this time the feeling was different. There was no envy, no resentment. There was only a profound and terrible sadness. He watched Rick Sterling standing near the farmhouse, a ghost on his own land. His face was pale and drawn, his expensive clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had lost too much weight. He stared straight ahead, his eyes empty, as the auctioneer began to dismantle his life, piece by piece. The bidding was sparse and cruel. Machines that had been bought for $100,000 sold for $20,000. The crowd was silent, the only sound the auctioneer's relentless chant and the mournful cry of the winter wind. When they got to the land, the bank bought most of it back itself for a fraction of its former value, adding it to its growing portfolio of foreclosed properties. Thomas watched it all, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw not the fall of a rival, but the tragic end of a man who had simply been a product of his time, a believer in a promise that had turned out to be a lie. While the auctioneer's voice droned on, Thomas thought of his father, of the lessons of thrift and caution, of the wisdom in the old ways. He thought of his paid-for tractors, his debt-free land, and the quiet peace of mind that came with them. He had been mocked as a relic, a man living in the past, but the past, it turned out, had saved him. When the auctioneer finally came to the last parcel, the original 80 acres that had been the Sterling family home place for 3 generations, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all, the farmhouse where Rick had grown up, the barn his grandfather had built. The bank started the bidding low, wanting only to clear it from their books. Thomas saw Rick flinch, a spasm of pain crossing his face as the place of his birth was put on the block. Without a second thought, Thomas raised his hand. His bid was quiet but firm. A few other bottom feeders, investors from the city smelling a bargain, tried to push the price up. But Thomas met every bid, his face calm, his resolve unshakable. He wasn't bidding with borrowed money. He was bidding with a decade of saved profits, with the fruits of his own labor. In the end, the others fell away. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed in the cold air. "Sold to Mr. Thomas Callahan." A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of shock and surprise. Thomas didn't acknowledge them. He walked slowly across the yard, past the sold machinery and the defeated faces of his neighbors, until he stood before Rick Sterling. Rick wouldn't look at him. He just stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped. "Why, Tom?" Rick asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Why would you do that? To gloat? To finally prove you were right?" "No," Thomas said, his voice gentle. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a simple, one-page lease agreement he had written out himself that morning. I did it because no man should have to watch his home sold out from under him. The rent is $1 a year. You and your family can stay. You can farm it. We'll work out a fair share of the crop. But the house is yours to live in as long as you want. Rick finally looked up, his eyes swimming with tears he refused to let fall. He saw no pity in Thomas's face, no smug victory. He saw only the quiet dignity of a decent man. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single jerky motion of his head. In that moment, the rivalry that had defined their lives for over a decade dissolved. It was replaced by something else, something quieter and more profound. It was the understanding that they were both just farmers, men of the soil, caught in a storm far bigger than either of them. The years that followed the great farm crisis of the 1980s were a time of healing and quiet rebuilding for Lancaster County. The landscape was scarred. Many familiar family names were gone from the mailboxes, replaced by corporate logos. But for those who had held on, there was a newfound respect for the old ways. Thomas Callahan, once the quiet outlier, became an unlikely pillar of the community. Young farmers, struggling to get by with limited capital, would show up at his workshop. "Mr. Callahan," they'd say, hat in hand, "I heard you know how to set the timing on an old Farmall magneto." Or, "My granddad's old John Deere two-cylinder won't start. Could you take a look?" He never turned anyone away. He would wipe his hands on a rag and patiently show them how to diagnose a problem, how to make a repair with simple tools, how to breathe life back into old iron. He taught them that a farm's wealth wasn't measured by the size of its equipment or the number of its acres, but by the health of its soil and the smallness of its debt. The neighbors who had once pitied him now sought his counsel. They saw that his stubbornness had been foresight, his caution had been wisdom. Rick Sterling stayed on the home place. The swagger was gone forever, replaced by a quiet humility. He and Thomas became friends, a development that surprised everyone, most of all themselves. They would often sit on the porch of the old Sterling farmhouse, drinking coffee and talking about the weather, the crops, and the price of corn. Rick worked the 80 acres with a small used tractor he'd managed to buy, and he helped Thomas during planting and harvest. He was a good farmer, and freed from the crushing weight of debt, he found a contentment he'd never known during the boom years. One warm evening in the late summer of 1989, Thomas was out in the barn with his grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael. The boy was sitting on the fender of the old Farmall M, watching his grandfather with wide, curious eyes. The tractor's red paint was now almost completely faded to a soft, sun-bleached orange, but the engine hummed with a steady, reliable rhythm. Thomas was adjusting the carburetor, his hands moving with the slow, certain grace of a lifetime of practice. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do you keep this old tractor? Dad says we could get a new one." Thomas finished his adjustment and wiped his hands. He looked at the old Farmall, at the dents in its fuel tank and the worn smoothness of the steering wheel. He saw more than just a machine. He saw his father's hands, he saw his own struggles, he saw the faces of the neighbors who had lost everything. "This tractor, Michael," he began, his voice soft. "It's more than just iron and steel. It's a reminder. It reminds me that the flashiest thing isn't always the strongest. It reminds me that what you own outright is worth more than anything you have to borrow to get." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and looked out the wide barn door. The sun was setting over his fields, bathing the land in a warm, golden light. The corn stood tall and healthy, a testament to a lifetime of careful stewardship. In the distance, He could hear the sound of Rick Sterling's small tractor finishing up a final pass. "Some people," Thomas continued, "spend their whole lives chasing the horizon, always wanting more, bigger, faster. They run so hard, they forget to look down at the ground they're standing on. This land, this farm, it's not about being the biggest. It's about being here tomorrow, and the day after that. This old tractor taught me that. As long as you take care of it, it'll take care of you." He reached up and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the rustle of the wind in the corn. It was the sound of a farm at peace, of a life lived on its own terms. It was the sound of vindication,